The first blow landed with a sickening crunch, metal crumpling under the force of the sledgehammer. The second sent a spray of plastic and shattered electronics skidding across the pavement. I lay sprawled on the sidewalk, helpless, as Valerie Harmon, the HOA president of Suncrest Estates, lifted the hammer again, her face twisted in fury. "HOA rules," she screamed, swinging down with every ounce of strength she had, shattering what was left of my wheelchair's control panel. Sparks flickered from the broken casing. Neighbors stood frozen in horror, some clutching their phones, recording the brutal scene unfolding before them. I struggled to move, my body refusing to cooperate, the pain from my fall radiating up my side. This wasn't just an act of vandalism. It was an execution of my dignity, my independence, my very ability to exist in this community. And Valerie wasn't stopping. The sudden blare of sirens cut through the air, and I heard the sharp bark of an officer's command. "Step away from the wheelchair, ma'am." Valerie, panting from exertion, turned, her chest rising and falling as she wiped a manicured hand across her forehead. "I was enforcing HOA standards," she snapped. "That thing is an eyesore." The officer ignored her, his eyes flicking to me, then back to her. "Do you even know who this is?" He spoke loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "That's Judge Robert Caldwell. The man who wrote our nation's disability housing laws." Valerie's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief. In that moment, as realization dawned, she wasn't the HOA president anymore. She wasn't the untouchable force that had bullied residents into submission for years. She was just another criminal who had picked the wrong victim. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time, not so long ago, when I was the one making the rulings, shaping the legal framework that protected people like me. I had spent 15 years as a judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, my early appointment driven by a career dedicated to disability law. My rulings had set legal precedents that protected millions of Americans, ensuring that those with mobility impairments weren't treated as second-class citizens. Ironically, I never imagined I would one day become a victim of the very discrimination I had spent my life fighting against. For most of my career, I had been in control. I was the one holding the gavel, the one delivering verdicts. But life has a way of humbling even the most steadfast. My multiple sclerosis diagnosis had started with something small, an occasional stumble, a tremor in my hands that I dismissed as stress. By the time it was official, the reality had already begun setting in. 3 years ago, I had to start using a wheelchair part-time. 2 years ago, my wife, Martha, passed away from a stroke, leaving me alone in a house that no longer made sense for me. The steps, the long hallways, the once beloved family home where we had raised 3 children, it had become a place of isolation rather than comfort. Downsizing was the logical step, and Suncrest Estates had seemed like the perfect solution. On paper, it was everything I needed. A single-story villa with wider doorways, no stairs, and a quiet, well-maintained community close to my medical specialists. My titanium wheelchair, custom-built to prevent pressure sores and designed for my diminishing hand strength, cost more than a luxury car, but it gave me the independence to continue living with dignity. I had read every word of the HOA covenants before purchasing my home. I had been assured, personally, that reasonable accommodations for medical necessities were allowed. And yet, before I had even finished unpacking, a violation notice had been taped to my door. That was my first introduction to Valerie Harmon. Dressed in her signature navy blue suit, clipboard clutched to her chest like armor, she arrived on my doorstep with a practiced smile that never touched her eyes. "Judge Caldwell," she greeted, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Welcome to Suncrest. I wanted to personally address the issue of your entryway." She gestured toward the accessibility ramp I had installed, its gentle slope blending seamlessly into the front pathway. At Suncrest, we maintain our property values through aesthetic consistency. Your apparatus disrupts our community standards. I had heard this argument before, just never directed at me. The Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act protect reasonable accommodations for medical necessities, I said evenly. This ramp is well within those legal protections. Her expression hardened slightly, though her practiced smile remained in place. With all due respect to your former position, she said, emphasizing former just a little too much, the ADA doesn't override our covenant. Residents choose Suncrest because we don't look like a medical facility. I knew then, in that moment, that this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement. This was a battle. And I was in the middle of it. The violation notices didn't stop. In fact, they multiplied with a level of precision that suggested more than just routine enforcement. Within a week, I had accumulated fines totaling over $1,000. The charges were absurd. My accessible entry ramp was deemed an unauthorized exterior modification. My van, with its wheelchair lift, was suddenly classified as a commercial vehicle, prohibited from being parked in my driveway. Even the small solar path lights I installed for safety were now a violation of non-standard exterior lighting. Each notice came with the same impersonal form letter, signed by Valerie Harmon, citing arbitrary rules with no room for discussion. I wasn't the only one under siege. Over coffee one afternoon, my neighbor Eleanor Wilson, an elderly widow with severe arthritis, hesitated before sliding an envelope across the table. Inside were pages of HOA fines she had accumulated over 2 years. The violation? A small wooden bench beside her mailbox. I just need a place to rest when I get the mail, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. I showed them my doctor's note, but they don't care. Valerie says it makes the neighborhood look unkempt. Her hands trembled as she spoke, not just from arthritis, but from the quiet, relentless fear of being pushed out of the home she had lived in for over a decade. I started asking questions, discreetly at first. What I found was worse than I had expected. The Whitmans, who had installed a temporary ramp so their disabled daughter could visit on weekends, had received escalating fines until they removed it. Dan Reynolds, a Vietnam veteran who relied on a service dog for PTSD, was constantly harassed by HOA security, who cited pet restrictions despite federal law protecting service animals. When he confronted Valerie directly, she dismissed him outright. Emotional problems aren't real disabilities, she had told him. A pattern was emerging, one that went beyond simple rule enforcement. It was targeted, deliberate, and strategic. Every resident facing harassment had one thing in common: a visible disability or medical need that disrupted Valerie's obsession with maintaining an image of perfection in Suncrest Estates. But the most damning revelation came when I dug deeper into the sales history of the neighborhood. In the last 5 years, at least 14 residents with medical accommodations had sold their homes at below market value, all after repeated fines and HOA pressure. Many of these properties were later purchased by a private company, Pristine Neighborhood Investments. The owner? A name that appeared on every one of my violation notices: Valerie Harmon. The realization made my stomach tighten. This wasn't about community standards. This was a racket. Valerie was systematically driving out elderly and disabled residents, devaluing their homes, and acquiring them through a shell company before flipping them at full market price. And she was getting away with it. Armed with this knowledge, I reached out to Lisa Carter, a civil rights attorney and one of my former law clerks. She listened patiently as I laid out my findings. "This is textbook housing discrimination," she said, already taking notes. "You have enough here to open a federal case. But first, we need to document everything." I installed legal-grade security cameras around my home, capturing every interaction, every violation notice, every instance of selective enforcement. And the harassment escalated. My water pressure suddenly dropped to a trickle. Community landscapers accidentally trampled my accessible garden beds. Maintenance crews ignored my requests for service, while security guards began conducting wellness checks at odd hours, knocking on my door late at night with vague concerns about unusual noises. Then came the anonymous letters. Short, cruel messages typed in bold font, slipped into my mailbox. Maybe it's time to find a more suitable place to live. If you can't follow the rules, maybe assisted living is a better option. One morning, I found my front door splattered with what looked like paint. A closer inspection revealed it was something more sinister, a mix of mud and garbage, smeared across my entryway like a crude warning. Valerie was pushing harder, growing bolder. I suspected she had convinced the HOA board that any accommodation would be a slippery slope. That once they allowed a wheelchair ramp, next would come medical transport vans, then caregivers, then hospital beds. It wasn't just that she wanted me gone. She wanted to send a message. But I wasn't about to back down. If she thought she could bully me into leaving, she had made a critical mistake. I had spent my life fighting for the rights of people like Eleanor, Dan, and the Whitmans. And now, I was going to fight for them again. Only this time, it was personal. The day Valerie Harmon finally snapped, I should have seen it coming. The pressure I had been applying was closing in on her from all sides, and for someone like Valerie, who thrived on control, intimidation, and the illusion of power, losing was not an option. The HOA board was starting to fracture. The younger lawyer, Greg Mitchell, had been asking questions. Neighbors who once stayed silent were beginning to grumble about the endless fines and aggressive enforcement. And then there was the financial audit, one she had delayed for months, that was now unavoidable. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. I had filed my formal complaints with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Arizona Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, attaching every piece of documented evidence, the selectively enforced fines, the anonymous harassment, the property sales linked to Valerie's shell company. But legal processes take time. Investigations could stretch on for months, even years. And in the meantime, I was still living in the middle of her personal war zone. I tried to maintain my routines, refusing to let her intimidation tactics dictate my life. My doctor had recently prescribed hydrotherapy to manage the muscle spasms caused by my multiple sclerosis. The hot, pressurized water helped ease the pain that had been worsening under the relentless stress of Valerie's campaign against me. So, I had a small therapeutic whirlpool installed on my private patio, completely enclosed, out of sight from the street. It was a medical necessity, not a luxury. But I should have known that wouldn't matter to her. 3 days later, my security system alerted me to movement in my backyard. Through the glass door, I saw her, Valerie Harmon, standing with 2 maintenance workers. One held a toolbox, the other looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot like he already knew this was going to be a problem. Valerie was holding a piece of paper, and the smug satisfaction on her face told me exactly what it was before she even spoke. I rolled outside, my voice steady despite the slow-burning anger coiling in my chest. "You're trespassing." Valerie ignored me, thrusting the paper forward like it was a royal decree. "Emergency abatement notice," she declared. "Your unauthorized hot tub violates 3 separate covenants and poses a health hazard. We're removing it now." I glanced at the so-called notice. It was complete nonsense. "This is a prescribed medical device," I said, holding up the waterproof folder containing my doctor's documentation. "Regardless, you have no legal right to enter my property without court authorization." She snatched the papers from my hand, barely glancing at them before tearing them in half. The sound of the paper ripping was shockingly loud. "I am the authorization," she snapped, turning to the workers. "Remove it. Now." The older of the 2 maintenance men hesitated. "Miss Harmon, this doesn't seem right," he said cautiously. "This looks like medical equipment." Valerie's carefully controlled mask cracked, and for the first time, I saw something raw beneath it, something unhinged. "Do your jobs or find new ones," she barked. This neighborhood is not going to look like a hospital on my watch. The workers still hesitated. That was when she turned abruptly and stalked toward the maintenance truck parked nearby. Moments later, she returned, dragging a sledgehammer behind her. "Fine," she muttered, her voice thick with fury. "I'll do it myself." I positioned my wheelchair directly between her and the whirlpool. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief that it had come to this. "Valerie, think about what you're doing. This is breaking multiple laws: criminal trespassing, destruction of medical equipment. This is a federal crime." Her lips curled into a sneer. "You think your rules apply here?" She lifted the sledgehammer, gripping it with both hands. "Your laws don't override my community standards." What happened next was so shocking that even now, it feels surreal. With one swift, brutal swing, she brought the sledgehammer down, not on the whirlpool, not on my property, but on my wheelchair. The impact sent a jolt through my body as the right wheel buckled under the force. I tried to maneuver away, but the sudden imbalance caused me to tip. My body hit the concrete hard, pain flaring instantly through my hip and shoulder. But Valerie wasn't done. She raised the hammer again and brought it crashing down on the wheelchair's control panel, shattering it completely. Sparks flickered as the electronics that gave me my independence were obliterated. "Please stop," I gasped, my voice breaking as I struggled to push myself upright. But she didn't stop. She kept swinging, methodically destroying every component: the frame, the specialized cushions, the remaining wheel. With each blow, she screamed phrases that would later become damning evidence in court. "No eyesores in my neighborhood. These people and their special equipment. This is what happens when you challenge the HOA." Neighbors had gathered by now, drawn out by the commotion, their faces frozen in horror. One of them was recording on his phone. Another had already dialed 911. The older maintenance worker was standing with his phone pressed to his ear, describing the scene in disbelieving tones. The last thing I remember before the sirens arrived was the sheer rage in Valerie's face as she lifted the hammer for another swing. She wasn't just enforcing HOA rules anymore. She was unleashing years of hatred, frustration, and control in one violent act. And this time, she had chosen the wrong victim. The sound of sirens cut through the stunned silence of the neighborhood, their high-pitched wail snapping everyone out of their shock. Valerie was still gripping the sledgehammer, her breath heavy, sweat dotting her forehead as she loomed over the shattered remains of my wheelchair. The hammer's head was smeared with grease and debris, pieces of metal and plastic littering the pavement around us. My hip throbbed in agony from the fall, my arms shaking as I struggled to push myself upright, but I barely registered the pain. My focus was locked on Valerie's face, the way the realization of what she had just done slowly crawled into her expression, twisting her confidence into something else, something almost like fear. The first officer to step out of the patrol car, badge gleaming in the midday sun, took one look at the scene and reached for his radio. His voice was clipped, urgent. "We need paramedics at Suncrest Estates, ASAP. Disabled male, injured. Possible criminal damage, possible assault." He approached cautiously, one hand resting near his holster, while his partner moved toward Valerie. "Ma'am, put the sledgehammer down." Valerie let out a short, breathy laugh, as if the absurdity of the situation was only just dawning on her. "I was enforcing HOA rules," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "This," she gestured toward my broken wheelchair, toward me still sprawled on the ground, "was a clear violation of our community standards." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone scoffed. Another person muttered something under their breath. The officer standing over me crouched down, scanning my injuries before his gaze flicked back up to Valerie. "Do you even know who this is?" he asked, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "That man is Judge Robert Caldwell. He wrote the federal housing laws on disability discrimination. The color drained from Valerie's face so fast I thought she might faint. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The weight of her mistake hit her all at once, as if she had just realized she hadn't taken a sledgehammer to a simple wheelchair, she had taken it to the wrong person, at the worst possible time, in front of the worst possible audience. By now, phones were out everywhere, neighbors capturing every second of her unraveling. The younger officer, who had been taking statements from the witnesses, turned back toward his partner and said something too low for me to hear. Within seconds, handcuffs were in his grip. I had no idea, Valerie stammered, stepping back, her hands raised slightly. So you're admitting you would have treated him differently if you had known he was a federal judge, the officer countered. That only makes the discriminatory intent even clearer. Before she could respond, the metallic click of handcuffs locking around her wrists sent a hush through the watching crowd. Valerie Harmon, you are under arrest for criminal damage, aggravated assault, and civil rights violations under federal housing law. A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Someone else clapped. Another person muttered, "About damn time." As they led her toward the squad car, the maintenance workers who had accompanied her finally spoke up. The older one, his face lined with worry, cleared his throat. "She's been telling us for months to remove accessibility modifications from people's homes," he admitted, running a hand over his graying beard. "Said we had to preserve the image of the community. We didn't understand what she meant until today." That was all the officers needed to hear. Within minutes, Valerie was shoved into the back of the patrol car, her wide eyes darting wildly as the reality of what was happening sank in. The neighbors who had once whispered about her behind closed doors were watching her fall apart in real time. But the fallout didn't end there. By the time the paramedics arrived and loaded me into the ambulance, my phone, knocked loose in the chaos, had already been recovered by a neighbor. It had landed face up on the pavement, screen still lit, the audio recording function running the entire time. Every insult, every discriminatory remark, every single thing Valerie had said as she smashed my wheelchair had been captured with crystal clarity. That audio, combined with the video footage from multiple neighbors and the maintenance worker's confession, was all it took. Within hours, news outlets caught wind of the incident. By the next morning, the footage had gone viral. HOA president arrested after sledgehammer attack on disabled judge. Housing discrimination case explodes after brutal HOA assault caught on camera. Judge Caldwell, who wrote landmark disability laws, targeted in hate crime. My hospital room was flooded with calls from journalists, disability rights activists, and even lawmakers. Messages poured in, emails from strangers, old colleagues reaching out, even a letter from a family in another state who had suffered similar discrimination but never had the means to fight back. My once personal battle against Suncrest Estates had become a national firestorm. But the biggest bombshell came when the financial audit results were leaked. As investigators combed through the HOA's records, they uncovered the full scope of Valerie's fraud. She hadn't just been enforcing arbitrary rules, she had been running a real estate scheme, systematically targeting elderly and disabled residents, finding them into financial distress, then acquiring their devalued homes through her shell company before flipping them for massive profits. For 5 years, she had made millions off the suffering of the people she claimed to be protecting. That revelation turned her case from a simple act of discrimination into a full-blown financial crime. Federal investigators descended on Suncrest Estates. Civil rights lawyers were already drafting lawsuits. Homeowners who had once been afraid to speak up were now demanding reparations and criminal charges. Valerie's carefully controlled world had collapsed overnight. And as I lay in my hospital bed, my body still aching from the fall, I realized something. I had spent my career ensuring the law protected vulnerable people. I had never imagined that one day, I would be the case that set the next precedent. 14 months after that afternoon, the day my wheelchair was reduced to rubble on a suburban sidewalk, I found myself in a familiar setting, but in an unfamiliar role. The federal courtroom was one I had presided over countless times in my career, but this time, I wasn't behind the bench. I was in the witness seat, my new custom wheelchair positioned across from the defendant. Valerie Harmon sat at the defense table, her once pristine navy suit replaced by a far less tailored version, her face drawn with exhaustion from months of pre-trial detention. The case against her had grown beyond what even I had anticipated. What started as a case of housing discrimination had unraveled into something much bigger: federal hate crime charges, wire fraud, racketeering, and elder financial abuse. The evidence was overwhelming: video recordings, witness testimonies, financial records, and even an attempted bribe to silence a key witness. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was harsh, but fitting. 9 years in federal prison. $4.2 million in restitution to victims. And, in what I can only describe as poetic justice, 2,000 hours of court-mandated community service, helping disabled individuals navigate housing accommodations and learn to use wheelchairs. The woman who had once swung a sledgehammer to erase disability from her perfect neighborhood would now spend years serving the very people she sought to oppress. But the real impact of this case wasn't just in her conviction. It was in the changes that followed. Arizona passed the Housing Equality and Accessibility Rights Act, implementing the strictest HOA oversight laws in the country. Other states followed suit, drafting their own reforms. Suncrest Estates, once a symbol of exclusion, became a model of inclusive senior living, its HOA leadership replaced and its original accessibility features restored. And with the settlement I received from my civil case, I founded the Caldwell Foundation for Housing Equity, providing legal aid to disabled homeowners nationwide. This case exposed a reality that many people never think about: how easily power can be abused behind the closed doors of an HOA, how some communities value aesthetics over humanity, and how quickly one person's unchecked authority can turn into a weapon. But it also proved something else: that with the right knowledge, the right persistence, and the right timing, one person can bring the entire system crashing down. And that leaves just one question: have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.